Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our content, and we're officially bringing the offseason breakdowns to a close with the two final teams in the Eastern Conference. It's been a long road, and we enjoyed every moment of it, and we hope you enjoyed every moment of it as well. We also have a media discussion or media day discussion lined up, and some other topics as well. But before we kick it off, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and X at the OBT Podcast for updates.
So we got two teams left in the Southeast division,
Hmm.
and really just two teams also left in, our NBA offseason, coverage. And
Yeah.
so we're going to get into these last two teams. So the first one we're going to do is the Washington Wizards, who had, in my opinion, a pretty busy offseason. Obviously, that's, his favorite team if you didn't already know.
Yeah.
Um, so, last year, obviously they had like a, kind of an up and down season where, they had stretches where they looked like a decent team. Where they had Bradley Beal, Porzingis, Kuzma as, kind of like a semi big three of sorts.
Hmm.
Um, with some other players on the roster. And then after a while, it just kind of became apparent that, they probably weren't going to be super competitive, right? So, eventually they kind of shut it down, right? Beal stopped playing as much. They also traded Rui, to the
Hmm.
Lakers, Kendrick Nunn, to kind of like, I guess, kind of shore up the roster and clear up some salary.
Yeah.
Um, but then obviously the real work came in the offseason, right? Bradley Beal, eventually finally wanted out of Washington.
Hmm.
He ended up getting traded to Phoenix. That initial part of the trade, was kind of bizarre, right? Because it ended up, he ended up going to Phoenix, who wasn't initially, right, like looked at, I think, as the number one destination. I think the Heat, if I remember correctly at the time, were kind of thought to be the go-to team, and then Phoenix kind of jumped into the fray.
Hmm.
And he ended up going to, Phoenix basically for Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, as well as some picks, right?
Yeah.
So, at the time, it didn't really feel like a great, return for Beal, right? Because what were you gonna do with Chris Paul? I mean, obviously you have the picks, which is nice, and some pick swaps,
Sure.
and then they were able to flip Chris Paul to the Warriors for Jordan Poole, and a future first. So obviously, they got some work done there, and then they also ended up moving Kristaps Porzingis as well, right? They shipped him off. They sent him to Boston, right, in exchange, and it was in a three-way deal, right, that brought them back. I think it was Tyus
Yep.
Jones, Tyus Jones, Danilo Gallinari,
Hmm.
and then a couple other players, if I'm not mistaken, as well, right?
Yeah.
Some picks. Yeah, I
Yep.
think like one of Boston's first round picks,
Hmm.
that they had traded over there. So now it kind of officially starts the rebuild, right? They also re-signed Kyle Kuzma, to a big, 4 or 5 year deal, right? Basically 30 million ish a year. So, they got pretty busy this offseason. Obviously, if you didn't remember, they also got a new front office as well, right? Right before, a lot of this offseason work.
Hmm.
Um, so again, now you look at the roster, right? And, you got a number of, a mix of a lot of different guys, right? There's still some holdovers from the previous roster, like say DeLon Wright, Johnny Davis, Denny Avdia, Corey Kispert, obviously Kuz, Daniel Gafford, but then you also bring in some new guys into the mix, right? Like Jordan Poole, Landry Shaman, who just got hurt. I believe Gafford also got hurt as well,
Yeah.
right? Like I said, other guys that came over from Boston and Golden State as well. Like I mentioned, Gallinari. Patrick Baldwin Jr. also came over from Golden State, right? Another young guy. So a mix of a lot of different guys. You got some flexibility in terms of size, on the wings. Guards. It's okay. It's a decent, it's okay mix of guards, right? Obviously, yeah, Poole, and then outside of that, a mix of different tiers of players.
Hmm.
A ton of young players also as well, right? And I think kind of the interesting aspect is, now that they're in a full rebuild, it'll be interesting to see what guys the front office really believes in because, like I said, this is a different front office than before. So, I do wonder how they feel about some of the young guys from the previous rosters.
Hmm.
Like I said, say like a Denny Avdia or a Corey Kispert,
Right.
versus the guys that they just brought in, like
Sure.
a Bilal Koulibaly, who I hadn't even really mentioned yet, right? That was kind of their big lottery draft pick, right? He's from France, right? He was on the same team as Victor Wembanyama, but obviously didn't get as much shine, right? Because he wasn't as big of a player, on that team.
Hmm.
Still very young, right? Still like 18 years old. He's got a lot of room to grow. He was a guy that kind of shot up, on those draft boards, right? He initially I don't think was looked at as like a, lottery talent, but
I had him
he
going
ended up
second
getting
round.
drafted. Yeah, exactly. He ended up getting drafted in the top 10. So we'll see. I think he does have a lot of potential. Again, he's got length, he's got, decent athleticism. He's just very raw, and he's very young. So we'll see how he grows. Um, but I don't have too much of a problem with the pick. It wasn't who I expected, though. In fairness, I think I thought, either, one of I thought that maybe a Sore might go to the Wizards, right? But he ended up getting picked higher
Hmm.
than I think we had him. And then also maybe I thought maybe they might pick Anthony Black, but he ended up, going elsewhere as well. So either way, I'm not too mad at the pick. But regardless, um, because I think he can be pretty good. But I do think, now I think when you look at this Wizards roster now, you have more of a sense of direction, right? Because before we didn't really know what this Wizards team was doing in terms of like, what is the goal, right? Like we
Hmm.
knew that they were trying to be quote unquote competitive, but how competitive were you going to be with the previous rosters, right?
Sure.
Because again, with Beal as your best player, how far were you going to go? And then how much could you really, do to the roster, with Beal being on that huge contract, right? It was kind of like the Lillard situation in Portland. So
Yes.
I think it made sense, to kind of eventually end that partnership and, like I said, engage in a rebuild. So, um, I guess obviously you're the big Wizards fan, so I'll
Hmm.
kind of let you, talk about it. But I do kind of like, the fact that now they've committed, to rebuilding, and it's probably going to start off pretty ugly, but I think brighter days will be ahead. But I kind of
Sure.
want to hear your thoughts. Again, being the resident Wizards fan.
Yeah. Well, on paper, I cannot lie to anybody. You cannot look at this roster and say it looks good. I think, you have to have watched a lot of these guys individually, I think, to kind of gather what, sense of direction they're headed for. I think this is going to be a faster team. I think this is going to be a team that plays at a completely different pace than what we saw, previous Wizards rosters play. It's not just going to be Beal kind of just working, ISO, and then if he has to drive, he kicks out to whoever his spot ups are. That's not what we're going to be playing. I think it's going to be very interesting to see, Tyus Jones be an actual commanding force on a roster. I think that's something that's kind of under talked about because he's been a backup point guard pretty much his entire career. So now this is the first time that he's really a starting PG on a roster that's not, like I said, the greatest, but I think that's something to watch for sure. But overall, I do like the roster as currently constructed. I think there's potential in every position. We have young guys in every single position. That's the thing that people don't understand. Gafford's fairly young. Tyus Jones, I mean, he's kind of a vet at this point. Kyle Kuzma, I think, is fairly young as well. Jordan Poole, like, the list goes on. Denny Avdia, Johnny Davis. But I thought it was kind of interesting, and this kind of tethers in the media day as well. But they were asking, guys like Johnny Davis, who didn't have the greatest rookie season, you know, how does it feel coming into the season? And he was basically saying the management is giving him a clean slate. It's almost as if the last season didn't happen. So that's kind of interesting. So I think a lot of guys on this roster also have something to prove. I think Jordan Poole has a lot to prove. I think Kyle Kuzma has a lot to prove. I think Tyus Jones has a lot to prove. Obviously Johnny Davis. You could go on and on. Even Bilal Coulibaly, he's 18. He wants to prove that he belongs in the NBA at such a young age. It's very unique. So I do like this roster in general. I think something that we haven't talked about yet are the vets as well. I think there are some decent vets on this squad. Taj Gibson, definitely a good vet. Seems like more of a locker room vet at this point. But then some vets that may get some playing time. You have Gallinari. I think that's an interesting pickup. I think he can also provide some floor stretching, I guess, but also some mentorship, maybe to a guy like Bilal, because, they're both foreign players. So maybe something like that. Um, but yeah, overall, I can't really be too mad at the roster. I understand what they did with Rui. I think, like you said, they got rid of Rui just in order to free up some cap space so they were able to, re-sign Kuzma and pay him. I think one guy that I think I'm a little bit concerned with is Avdia. It seems like he's had some health issues in general, and it's kind of, I feel like, stinted his development in a way. I feel like he could have been a lot better and a little bit farther along if he wasn't hurt so often. I know sometimes, like, they consider him like an Iron Man because I think there was one season where he didn't miss any games, which is pretty good. But it seems like when he does get hurt, it's like nagging stuff that you can
Right.
tell is bothering him when he plays. And that's never a good sign, I think. But I would like to see him take a leap. But I think every player on this roster that's going to be in the starting five likely is probably going to be taking a big leap in some way, shape, or form, whether it's to get paid somewhere else or, just have a bigger role in the franchise. And I think that's what it's all about because at
Right.
this point, this is year one of the rebuild. I think we can solidify that for sure. And it's not as bad as some other rebuilds that I've seen in the past. This isn't like bare bones. I think there's a lot of
Right.
potential. There's even some tradable pieces.
Yeah.
People like Gallinari, Patrick Baldwin, guys like that, Anthony Gill. I think those are tradable people. And it's kind of nice to have those guys around in your back pocket, say, for depth reasons, or if you want to go out there and get another young piece.
Right. And I think
Yeah,
oh,
what's up?
sorry, go.
No, no, continue.
Yeah, and I think you did hit the nail, on the head, when you talk about like it's a good mix of, like you said, young guys, that have the opportunity. Because like you mentioned, Johnny Davis, was a top 10 pick and he didn't play at all last year.
Right,
And I guess part of that was because the Wizards, were trying to be, more of a competitive roster.
right,
But now, that it's a rebuild, now he should have the opportunity to play, and, kind of prove that he, does belong in the league, right? Because, a lot of people, I think, were pretty disappointed in how he looked as a rookie last year, and in some ways it looked a little alarming,
yeah,
just because again, a top 10 pick that wasn't playing, basically until their season was completely over. Um, but you can't necessarily, write him off just yet because
right,
he's still a young guy. But
exactly.
and then like you said, I think the other aspect is you do have a number of pieces that teams might be calling for at the deadline to get even more picks,
Hmm.
kind of like what Portland did with Dame, right? Where, again, like you mentioned Gallinari, you mentioned, the other guys, but even other guys, like I mean,
Delon
I think
Wright.
it might ask for like a DeLon Wright
Yep.
or like even pick up a Tyus Jones or, a Landry Shamet,
Hmm.
or somebody like that, right? Like all those guys have been on, different teams, at different points in their careers. And I
Sure.
think, they could help some of these teams. And, again, the Wizards have them. So they, like you said, in their back pocket, they have, moves to make where, hey, we can have some vets right now that can kind of show them the rope. So it's not like a completely disastrous, situation where it's
Hmm.
only young guys, that want to play.
Right.
Right. Um, and then as you get deeper into the season, right, as teams start calling, and trying to improve their rosters, all these guys are on pretty tradable contracts, right? Like obviously Poole and Kuzma are making a lot of money, but they're not going to be dealt anywhere this season. Those are kind of like at least right now, kind of like the the pillars, I guess, of this team. So
Hmm.
and that's kind of the other interesting aspect is that, like you said, both guys are relatively young guys. And even though, despite the fact that both of them were part of championship teams, right, they were kind of moved, away from
Yeah.
those teams, right? And particularly, say even like, Jordan Poole, right? Because, he was, an even bigger part of the Warriors title than Kuzma was, for LA,
Absolutely.
even though Kuzma was a part of that championship team, right? Like, Poole, you know, at different points was like, their second or third best player, like at different
Right.
points. And then, obviously we know what happened, right? He had a bad, year last year, right? Obviously didn't get along, in the locker room, right? Because, Draymond punched him.
Right.
Um, and obviously that caused some chemistry issues. So, like I said, I think those guys have something to prove as well, right? And I think Poole will play with a chip on his shoulder. And I think, he'll like the fact now that, like, he's kind of, on a team where, yeah, he gets to be one of the main guys. He gets to have the ball a lot. He gets to take a lot of shots.
Yeah.
And he already got his title, right? And, he got money. So, I think that's, kind of a good spot for him to be in, as well as to continue his development. Cause I still think like, like I'm not gonna, I don't think we should just give up on Jordan Poole.
No, not
Like
at
in the
all.
sense of like, I know he had a bad season last year for Golden State, but I still think he can be a good, impactful player. Like obviously, is his ceiling as high as what we might have thought it was going to be, or what a lot of people might have thought it was going to be? Probably not. But I still think he's, again, he's a scoring archetype, but I still think he's better than like your typical scoring archetype because I think there are times where he can fit in easier, alongside other players because we saw at the title year where like, yeah, you can give him the ball and he can create his own offense, but he can also play within the flow of the offense, right? Because he played next to guys like Steph and Clay, and he can play off the ball and run off a lot of screens as well.
Yeah.
Um, but, I think that was still like more of a financial thing as well
Oh,
too, with the
100%.
CBA. I'm sure the chemistry stuff was a big part as well, but I think they would if the CBA thing wasn't a thing, I think they would have at least tried to work it out.
Mhm.
But, I'm expecting a big year from him,
Yeah.
this year. And, like you said, some of the other guys on the roster, like a Denny Avdia, right? He was a lottery pick. What does he do this season, right? Because, he's got some value, as kind of like a do it all versatile type forward, right? Especially on the defensive end, but his offense is, primarily his shooting, has kind of been a bit spotty,
Yeah.
no pun
It's
intended.
been
So,
horrible. Hmm.
right. So, like, how does he grow as a player? Again, Kispert's a shooter, right? So he does have an established skill set as a shooter, right? But, he doesn't really do much else. Um, so could that be a guy, that's a younger guy, right? That maybe a team might call for, at the deadline, again, as a shooter. I don't know. But, um, like you said, I think they did a better job than I think we initially thought going in because the Beal trade initially looked, in my opinion, pretty rough. When they got back was Chris Paul, and again, that was a tough situation also because the previous front office gave Beal a no trade clause.
Yeah.
So that made it a lot harder, to really put together a package, right? Like you couldn't put together a Lillard type package. I mean, I don't think Beal is as good as Lillard, but either way, you wouldn't have gotten back an amazing package anyways because of the no trade clause. You had to sell low,
Right.
but they still ended up turning, Beal into something, right? Like a tangible young asset, like a Jordan Poole. Maybe he's not seen as quite of an asset because of the contract, but that's still better than just having Chris Paul. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah, I get
like,
you.
yeah, like if it wasn't for the no trade clause, maybe they would have been the team that could have gotten DeAndre Ayton, right? But Beal
Sure.
pretty much, he said, like, hey, if he's in the deal, I'm not going to accept it, and then, of course, he ended up trading him anyways, but still.
Yeah.
Um, so I do like a decent amount of what the Wizards did this offseason. Again, shedding the contracts of Beal and Porzingis and getting things back for them, including picks and, some young guys and some other vets that you can either trade down the line or, like you said, have mentor the young guys. It's year one of a rebuild, right? And then now, the coach, right, Wes Unseld Jr., right, what does he do? Like in
Mm.
terms of like, now that there's not as many expectations, right? Now he can probably, kind of coach things like, how he might want to, as
Sure.
opposed to like kind of coaching in a way where it's like, oh, we can't play this guy because we're trying to win games, or we can't play this guy because we're paying him, X amount of money. What does that look like?
Well,
Because
I did hear in the media availability, he said they're gonna be focusing on the pick and roll a lot, paint defense for defense obviously, and then Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma both kind of hinted at them taking turns playing off the ball, and
right,
sometimes both of them playing off the ball.
right, and they can do that.
Exactly. So it's really interesting. But continue. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so like, that's another aspect of it as well, right? Because I know, he's, kind of one of these new coaches and, it hadn't been great in Washington, the last couple of years. And, some of that has just been injuries, and just the roster itself, but now, like, he's got a clean slate. So what does that look
Sure.
like? Again, does he survive this Wizards rebuild? Because like we've seen, a number of coaches in the past where it's like, they hire a guy, to begin the rebuild. And then like once the rebuild is over, it's like, oh, well, now you're gone. We're going to pick up somebody else.
And he had a good stint in
I don't
Denver.
right, yeah, because I can't really get a beat on him necessarily. Because I know, I think he's regarded as like not being great, but then like at the same time, it's like, there wasn't like a ton to work with.
Yeah. They
And there
say his
were times
player development is the best aspect, but so far it's
mhm,
been pretty abysmal if you ask me. Like Denny
right.
hasn't
So yeah,
taken a
and
crazy
that
leap. Johnny Davis isn't that great as of right now. Corey Kispert is still one dimensional.
right.
So I haven't seen the player development stuff that they've been praising him for.
Right. So yeah, so that's so again, like I said, I think that's ultimately, how you look at, this roster. Because again, it's like it's year one of a rebuild, right? And it was a rebuild that kind of just I don't want to say came out of nowhere, but it, like it felt like it should have happened already. So I feel like it could have been better, but at the same time, I do think what you got, is still solid because I think
Sure.
again, you put yourself in a better position, for the future. Because again, like I said, you got a couple young guys back. You drafted some other young guys, and you have contracts to move. Potentially down the road for picks or whatever. So I think given the circumstances, because again, I think the previous front office put them in a rough spot. I'd say this was, a solid attempt, I think, at the Wizards, like I said, establishing, some type of direction. So
Yeah,
I
I
guess
agree.
to kind of, put a bow on it for the most part, what grade would you give the Wizards for their offseason? Because, they did a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
I would probably give them a B. I
mhm,
can't go an A just because there's some things I don't like on the roster. Like I don't like that there's barely any center depth. That's a no go for me.
right.
But in general, I think acquiring the young guys from Golden State, Jordan Poole included, I think that was a great, phenomenal move. To be able to flip Chris Paul for that, I don't know how they did that, but it is what it is. And then obviously, finally moving on from Beal and then getting some Chris Paul back and then flipping that, like I said, it all stems from the same issue of moving on from Beal. And I think, a little case of, too late, but at the same time, they still worked it out, got it done, and then drafting Bilal Coulibaly, great move as well. So can't be too mad at it, but like I said, only issue for me is the center depth.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think, like I said, I'd say B, B plus, because like I said, I do think that they, given the circumstances, I think they, did a decent job, of getting back something for Beal. Because again, it
Right.
wasn't going to be a Lillard type return because he's not the same type caliber of player, and
Hmm.
also he has the no trade clause, so that so that made it tough. But like I said, I think given the circumstances, right, you brought back Kuzma, right, so regardless of whether or not you keep him, you didn't lose the asset.
Right.
You made some, multiple draft picks, right, including Bilal Coulibaly, who's, kind of the main one. And again, like you broke up those contracts into the smaller ones, right? So you have a number of contracts that you can either keep, for guys to mentor the young guys or trade down the line. So I can't really complain too much. Like you said, the center depth is pretty rough, and it's already rough because Daniel Gafford is hurt with
Yeah.
an elbow injury, so he's going to be out for a little bit. So I do wonder who steps into the starting center spot, right? Like I mean, it's probably I guess it's probably going to have to be like Mike Muscala or somebody.
Great.
Um,
Great.
because the only other one is Taj Gibson. So I mean, and I don't think he's going to start just because of his age. I mean, he's basically what like 38. So,
Yeah.
um, like I said, I think overall, I think they did a pretty good job. I guess kind of like one last note on the Wizards.
Yeah.
Which young player do you think you are probably the highest on?
Okay.
Of like the newer guys. Like obviously like not counting like say like a Jordan Poole or somebody
Right.
like that 'cause he's already established,
Right.
but of a lot of the other young guys that are trying to find a role for themselves, which guy do you think you're the
Right.
highest on?
Like you said, we can't really talk about Kyle Kuzma, Jordan Poole. I think, we know where they're at for sure. But, looking around the roster, I know this might be a hot one, but I'm gonna have to say Johnny Davis. And this is a guy that I pretty much was not a fan of, last year at all because he didn't play. But those last 5 games that he played, he looked great. He actually looked like he belonged in the NBA and he looked like a lottery pick. But hopefully, he can continue that streak. And I hope, that Unseld Jr. gives him, the opportunity to play. But I would definitely say Johnny Davis tops that list. I'm not expecting too much from Bilal. I think he'll be better down the line, but this season, I doubt he's even going to play that much because I've heard rumblings that he's going to be in the Go Go, which is our
Hmm.
G League affiliate, which is an interesting move. I'm not sure why our
Yeah,
lottery pick I don't
for
know
a
why our
lottery.
lottery pick is going straight to the G League, but
Yeah.
maybe it's because he's so young. I get it. And then Avdia probably. I'm gonna take Avdia to take a bigger leap than Corey Kispert. I think Corey Kispert at this point, he's kind of just a one-dimensional shooter. That's pretty much it. He doesn't play defense, has no bag. But Denny Avdia, I think, he has all the tools and the physical gifts to be a little bit better than than previous seasons. It's just a matter of health and if he can avoid the nagging injuries and actually get his shot together.
Yeah, like I said, I'm kind of in the spot where I think, yeah, probably like an Avdia, or somebody like that, probably makes sense.
Hmm.
Maybe Davis. Again, in terms of playing time, you do have Poole, so like how much
Right.
does he play, in terms of like, over Poole? But,
Sure.
I think those are solid picks because again, like, some of the other guys, like Patrick Baldwin Jr., I think is like, more of like a project guy. I know he's
Yeah.
like, kind of like a big skill forward, but, still. And like you said, Corey Kispert, I think kind of already is what he is, as a shooter. And then everybody else, like again, it's kind of like that where we already know who they are, right? Like we
Sure.
like Poole obviously can get better, but like I said, he's already established, so I don't
Right.
really want to, you know,
He
loop
doesn't
him in the
count.
same. Yeah, I don't want to put him in the same group as the other guys because again, he's already an established player who got paid and won a title.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the over under for them is 24.5, which is 10 wins lower than the next one, which is the Jazz. Yeah, I mean, they're probably going to be, pretty bad record-wise. But again, like
Really? You think so? Me see,
Well, I
my thing is I think there's a lot of false narratives going on about the Wizards. I think we're gonna be better than what people are predicting. I don't
yeah,
think we're gonna win only 24 games. I doubt that.
like they'll probably win more than 24 games. It's just again, is it 30? Is it 35? Because I mean, 35 is kind of like inching closer to like playing territory. And I don't necessarily think it's good enough to be like a playing team. But I think they might be able to get to 30. It's just a matter of like, you know, how healthy are some of these guys? How many teams can they beat? Because again, they are in the East. So like they do have the benefit of there's going to be some teams that you're going to be playing, 3, 4 times a year that you'd have a better chance at beating, right? Like,
Sure.
they have a better chance of beating, some of the other teams at the bottom of the East than some of the teams at the bottom of the West, right? Cuz like, there are some teams that are going to be like 10, 11th in the West that could be a playoff team or a playing team in the East.
Right.
So that's the only thing. But again, I think that's what they want. Like I don't think they want to be like a play-in team or better. I think they want to be like, a bottom five,
Yeah.
roster that has a top five pick. Like,
I agree, but at the same time, I don't think they're gonna just win 26 games. I think they're gonna win a little bit more than that. I think
yeah,
they're gonna win probably 30.
it just depends because, like I said, there are some other teams that I think, it just kind of depends on like, what line you look at. But like, again, like, because like there are some other teams like Detroit is at 28.5. Like, are they gonna win more games than Detroit?
I think
Like,
so.
you think so?
Yeah. Cade
That
Cunningham
I
can't stay healthy. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's we have to talk about that. Like certain
Mhm.
guys on these teams, yeah, they look better on paper, but halfway
Mhm.
through the season they're gonna be freaking beaten and battered, and we're probably gonna be a little bit healthier, and we can beat those teams. Like Charlotte is gonna be injured halfway through the season. So is Detroit. I'm not praying for
Yeah.
anybody's
Um,
injuries, but
Plus, like when you look at, the over unders, like I said, for the other teams that are kind of like in a similar range, right? Like, Portland's at 28.5, right? Detroit's at 28.5, and then the Spurs are at 29.5. So there's only four teams that are projected to win fewer than 30 games.
right,
So, like are the Wizards better than the Spurs? Are they better than Portland? Are they better than Detroit? Like you said, I think there's a world where like, yeah, if they're healthy and the other teams aren't, then yeah, like they could have a better record. But the thing is that now, with the flattened lottery odds, you don't have to have the worst record anyway. So
right,
like you could have the fourth worst record and still get the number one pick.
right,
Like it's kind of what happened in the draft. And like in reverse, right? Like say Detroit I think had the worst record, but they dropped all the way down to like five. Because they could have easily had Wenbanyama. So that's the good news is that like you said, you could still win like 29, 30 games, right? So you could win a couple more games than these other teams and still get, a top two pick. Like, so
right.
I think that's kind of a good way to look at it, right? Because
Well,
ultimately,
like
like,
also
the
these
bottom five,
guys, they don't want. I feel like the players themselves don't want to lose, and I think when
no,
you have two young guys who won a championship, I think they're
right.
looking to actually shock the league. That's what I'm saying. I think the chips on their shoulders will probably prevent them from being the worst team in the East. That's all I'm
Yeah.
saying. Like,
And then,
and I'm not praying for anybody's injuries or anything like that. I was just
right.
saying, most likely those guys will get hurt because of their injury history. Like Lamelo Ball and Cade Cunningham historically have not been healthy guys.
Yeah. And then the other aspect is, with the new rules, you can't sit healthy guys necessarily anymore. So
Right.
you can't get away with like, oh, this guy, he's got, kind of like a weird thing and we got to sit him out for like 20 games, even though he could probably play, in like half of those. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
they can't do that either. So, there's no more like, if a guy can play, then we're still not going to play him like that. That can't happen as much this year without like a significant fine. And some of
Right.
the smaller market teams probably wouldn't want the fine, just because, then they don't have as much money in the bank as some of the other teams. So
Sure.
I think that's the other factor as well. Because I didn't even think about that. Because like with the lottery odds, yeah, in a way it doesn't really matter, where the bottom three teams finish because
Right.
they still have the same exact odds. So like. The Wizards could be a little bit better, than 24.5 wins, but they could still get like the number one
I'm
pick.
telling you, they're gonna be better than that. I refuse to believe that we're gonna be that bad.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, even if you are, that's what they want. You know what
Right.
I mean? Like they want to be a bottom five team to get a top pick, right?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with us being, a bottom five team. It's just I think that's low on our win column for
Mhm.
me. just
Yeah.
with the roster
Like
currently constructed, I think that's selling us a little short.
right. Like you'll still have a chance at the end of the day to get one of the top guys,
Hmm.
like and I think you'd rather have that than, be like a 500 team, every year as a play-in roster. Like I
Tell me
think
about it. We've been
yeah,
doing
uh,
that for years. Like it's been
right.
mediocrity after mediocrity, and it's been like that for a long time. Pretty much
Right.
ever
So
since John Wall left.
yeah, so I think the front office and I think the ownership as well, like deserve, some credit, for finally,
Sure.
putting their foot down and choosing a direction to take this team into. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. I I I I'm not mad at the rebuild at all, and it kind of goes back to our earlier episodes when the trades were first going on. You know, I know a lot of people were up in arms about the Wizards getting fleeced, but not the case. I think our returns were as good as you can get.
Yeah, and you never know because then, let's say Phoenix, let's say their window is like, I don't know, 2 years or something like
Mm,
that. And then, like, say by the time year three, year four rolls around, they're not looking as good. And then Phoenix will be, or excuse me, Washington will be able to swoop in and, get those picks.
sure.
Um, now we're going to go into our last team, and that's the Atlanta Hawks.
Oh boy.
Um, so, this team was in a different spot, than the Wizards.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, in some ways, probably a little bit more disappointing. Right. So obviously they made a big move, last offseason, right? Trading for DeJounte Murray. Um, in exchange, I guess, for, they sent away Gallinari and I think three future firsts, right? I think two of the three were unprotected. So there was a lot of expectations, I think, in terms of like the Hawks, kind of need to be, like a good team. And they were basically we'd said it pretty much the whole time last year, right? Where they were pretty much like the definition of average, right? They were exactly 500, record of 41 and 41. Um, and it just Trey Young played in 73 games and DeJounte Murray played in 74, so it wasn't like they missed a ton of time. DeAndre Hunter played in 67. So most of their core guys played a decent amount, but for whatever reason, it just seemed like it just wasn't working. Like the fit with Trey Young and DeJounte Murray, I don't think is necessarily bad. Like it's not perfect, but again, the main thing is neither guy really plays off the ball like that. Um, but, in sense of like, offense, defense, that's fine. But then you also had a couple other guys that I think, just were also very underwhelming, right? Like, obviously a big part of the story was John Collins, right? Who did, suffer, who was playing through an injury, I think. From what I remember, it was like a
Mhm.
wrist injury, but he did not have a very good season.
Mhm.
Um, numbers pretty much down all across the board, especially the shooting, right? Because it seemed like he had figured some stuff out as a shooter. And we talked a lot last year about, the idea of him being traded to another team picking him up, and they sold really low on him, right? That
Yeah.
was kind of like their first offseason move was they traded him to the Jazz basically for Rudy Gay. Like, and that was pretty much it. Who they ended up cutting.
Right.
So, that's about as low as you can get in terms of trading a younger guy for an older guy that you didn't even keep. So, and they've also been, in some rumors for Siakam, but they also drafted Kobe Buffkin, right, with their first round pick. Obviously a guard. Got I guess two-way potential, but he'll obviously he's going to play behind the guards that they have right now. So I don't have too many issues with that. Um, made some other deadline moves, right, last offseason, right, where they traded for Sadiq Bey, right? In that big three-teamer deal right between them. I think it was the Warriors and Detroit,
Mhm.
right? Um, and that's fine, right? AJ Griffin had a solid rookie year. Jalen Johnson had a solid rookie year. So they have a number of guys that I think are, solid players.
Sure.
Um, and then the other headline, of course, was remember they fired Nate McMillan and brought in Quinn Snyder, who I do think is an upgrade as a head coach. But, ultimately, I don't really know, how to feel about this Hawks roster. Like, I mean, in terms of the picks, Kobe Buffkin, Muhammad Gaye, you know, we'll see how much they play. But then after that, like, who slides in, say for John Collins, right? I'm
Mhm.
assuming it's gotta be, is it, do they like slide DeAndre Hunter over to the four and
Mhm.
then maybe start like AJ Griffin?
Hmm.
Do they start Sadiq Bey and DeAndre Hunter? Maybe Sadiq Bey is like, acts as like a small ball four. Which, I think there's a lot of experimenting with that because you can be a little bit more switchy than you were
Sure.
before. But, I don't know, like just giving up on Collins, and again, maybe he's damaged goods. I don't know, but like I don't know how to feel about this roster. Like I think you could go a lot of different ways. Like somebody could talk me into them being like a 6 seed or something like that, and like it wouldn't surprise me. Or they could be like a play-in team again, and it wouldn't surprise me either. Like I mean, I don't know. Like I feel like the improvement was just, like, very minimal, you know what I mean? I don't even know
Sure.
if you'd even consider it improvement. I think maybe you could consider the Collins thing potentially addition by subtraction, and the team will look a little bit different because again, they'll be a little bit more switchy, because Collins is more of a big, right? Whereas, the guys that will play, ahead of him will be forwards,
Hmm.
like, more like wing forwards. But I don't know. Like I said, I really don't know how to feel about this team. I like the Quinn Snyder upgrade. But again, like, how much better is this team going to be if they're even better at all? Capella versus a Kongwu. I like a Kongwu as a young guy, but you do have Capella. So, I mean, like, he's probably still going to get the starting nod, but I don't know. I mean, talk me into this team or out of this
Okay.
team because I don't really know how to feel about this
I'll
roster.
talk you in a little bit. I think,
Okay.
one thing that is underrated about this squad, and by no means am I high on this squad at all. I think they're probably going to be a playing team. But
Right.
I think their depth is something that shouldn't be taken so lightly. They have a
Right.
lot of wing depth, and I think they turn that, around from John Collins because I feel like it didn't always used to be that way. Now they have um, even AJ Griffin was there last year, but just looking at the forwards, there's a lot of them. Sadiq Bey, AJ
Yeah.
Griffin, Jalen Johnson, and DeAndre Hunter, of course. I think, this is something that's good. I think, even adding Kobe Buffkin, I don't necessarily understand taking him, to be honest, to this squad because I feel like he could be a future starter down the line. But,
Hmm.
I guess sitting behind Trey Young and DeJounte Murray isn't too bad. So, it is nice to see him be in a good situation. And then, Patty Mills, like that's a decent guard room if you ask me. Trey Young, DeJounte Murray, Patty Mills, and Kobe Buffkin. That's interesting to me. So I feel like, they do have a lot of depth at certain positions. You know what I mean? That's kind
Yeah.
of that's really the only thing I could say. Because I'm kind of with you where a lot of their moves were just like, like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
This doesn't really make us
They
any
feel like
better.
cost
Yeah.
moves to me.
Yeah. Like, it didn't really make them, by any means championship contenders. It may have like kept them where they were to the point where they're still going to be a playing team, but I think they are somewhat better in terms of that depth. But that's really all I have to say about this team. Um because I mean, they didn't really do much of anything else. They didn't attract any big name free agent guys. I mean, they got what, Wesley
And they
Matthews. Like, I don't know. It's interesting to me, but
yeah, and they were
in
already
general,
capped out, so they
yeah.
weren't going.
Yeah, I think they're just kind of banking and hoping that Trey Young and DeJounte Murray can mesh together a little bit better. And, a quote unquote better head coach will get the most out of them. We'll see. But I mean, I'm not, like I said, I'm just not super high on this team, but I'm not trying to hate either because I think,
Right.
we could probably see them make a playoff appearance.
Yeah.
I
I think
think, if they're in the play in, they'll get out of it.
Yeah, I guess the other aspect of optimism is like, Trey Young offensively, his numbers were down,
Hmm.
like from an efficiency standpoint,
Hmm.
across the board, right, from the year before, right? Because like the year before, right, 28 a game, 10 assists, 46 from the field, 38 from 3. That's
That's
pretty
crazy.
good.
That's crazy.
Um, but then last season, right, 26 and 10, which, counting stats, that's fine, but 43 from the field, 33 and a half from 3, that's pretty low.
Right.
Because it felt like his shooting was getting better. Because again, like, he's got the reputation as like a long range bomber, but then you look at the numbers and like,
Yeah.
should he really be taking those? But
That's why
if he's
people
gonna make
call him the
38%
poor
of
man
his
Steph.
right, yeah, exactly. But if he makes 38% of his threes, yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Hmm.
Um, so I think like, the optimism there is again, he's still young, he's 25, that's pretty young.
Right.
Um, so he still hasn't even gotten to his, peak yet. And again, with a different coach, and a different system, can they get him to do some more things off the ball? And kind of like lower his usage somewhat as well.
He might
And
fly under the radar this year.
right, exactly. Because I think he's gotten to a point now where you could almost say he might be a little underrated now.
Very.
Because I feel like he was, pretty heavily, ripped to shreds last year.
Yeah.
Just because again, like the Hawks weren't great. Obviously the coach firing wasn't a good look either. and then the numbers weren't as good. So that's the other aspect as well. But, because again, we even talked about, his name was in trade rumors
Yeah,
at
which
different
is
points.
ridiculous.
Right. So, I don't know. And again, like I know part of it was like it was kind of reported in the sense of like, hey, if the Hawks aren't too competitive, maybe he'll ask out. But then there was also aspects where it's like maybe the ownership wouldn't mind it as well.
Right.
So, again, like maybe there's also some optimism, like I said, with the new coach, in terms of can he make this pairing fit a little bit better. Like I said, it's a little tough because it's like Murray's not a great outside shooter, so Trey Young kind of almost has to play off the ball, but that's just not how he plays.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, they might
you
try and like
know,
mold him into Steph, and I don't think that's a good idea because I feel
right?
like the comparison is always going to be there just because he
Yeah,
does like to bomb the 3 pointers and they both
yeah.
have a terrific ball handle,
They're
but they're
different
not the
players,
same player. They're so different,
right?
especially if you
Yeah,
really
exactly.
watch and break down how they play. Like it's a completely different play style.
Right, exactly. And that yeah, because I know in college he played off the ball
Right.
at different points. Obviously he was playing, with worse teammates just because
Right.
it's college basketball. But still, like I guess that's kind of where some of the if there is optimism where it would come from is like you mentioned some of the depth is changed around because now you're putting in more wings and then
Mm-hmm.
also the coach, how much can a coach make a difference for a team? We've seen it happen, at times. I mean, obviously, most people would say that the talent is the most important thing in the NBA and then the
Sure.
coach is next after that. um but at the same time, like I said, I think this could go in a lot of different ways because I feel like still expected them last year to be better than like just 500 because
Me
they
too.
had a good start to the year, and they had some other, like, random injuries from other players, where they missed time and, like, that probably, hurt them as well, but still, like, 41 and 41 is a little bit bizarre.
Especially
Um,
with Trey Young and considering the runs that they've been on in the past.
right, and that's the thing is, the further away you get from that, how much of that was, maybe it was a little bit fluky,
Right.
where they just had, like, a hot run versus, like, was that actually a good team on the rise?
Right.
Maybe it could just be maybe they bought in a little bit too early, where it's like, maybe they weren't necessarily ready to make the move to, acquire DeJounte Murray, or maybe just not have given up 3 unprotected firsts,
Yeah.
for that, and help the Spurs potentially get better. Because that, also kind of hurts the Hawks' negotiating power. Because then it's like you have to give up more players, as opposed to like, oh, maybe we could give up like one player in a pick. Well, you don't
Mm-hmm.
have any picks, so like
Yeah.
you'll have to give up probably like two, maybe three players.
Yeah.
Um,
They're in a debacle, man.
right. Do you think the Siakam deal makes like if they were to get Siakam, do you think that fit makes sense? Because like I do think it makes sense in terms of like obviously you get more high end talent, but then at the same time like you also factor in like then it's like well now you have three guys who aren't necessarily great outside shooters, so how does that look?
I was gonna say.
Because
Well,
already Murray's not a great outside shooter. And it's like Siakam and Trey Young are not bad 3-point shooters, right? It's just again like with Siakam, how much do guys guard him? Obviously, people guard Trey Young, um, but still, that's kind of a bizarre, fit. But I do feel like the Hawks at a certain point, it's like, well, you gave up the picks, and now you kind of have to, kind of like Minnesota. It's like you already gave up stuff to get somebody, and it didn't necessarily work out in the way that you were hoping. But you're almost kind of in a position now where you kind of have to like, improve on that. You know what I mean? Where it's like you kind of have to like, this is the team you have, so now you kind of have to buy in and find ways to improve, right? Because otherwise, like if you're bad, well, that doesn't help you because you don't get a pick. So like now
right.
you kind of have to keep going. But what is the real ceiling of this team? Because is it really that high? Like I don't think so. Like even if they had, like a Pascal Siakam, like would that trio get out of the East? Like probably not.
I don't think it would get out of the East. I think they could make a playoff run. I'm not going to say a deep one, but I don't think they could, win the title, obviously. But
Yeah,
I think, their goal at this point, like you said, they don't really have picks, I think would be to actually win some games. So
yeah,
if, bringing
competitive.
in Siakam, can get them some wins, then I don't have an issue with it.
Right.
Um, and I think, they do need to do something because if they don't have picks, you got to move somebody because I don't think they like I said, they got better to the point where, we've changed our minds on how we view this team. So it's like, say they deal, I don't know, Kobe Buffkin, Sadiq Bey, and something else for, Siakam. Okay, then that's cool because I know Kobe Buffkin was on Toronto's radar for a little bit. and then they get a good young forward in Sadiq Bey. So I don't know. But at the same time, I do understand if they're not willing to do that because, like you said, it would be hard to have three ISO gods on one team. Siakam, we already know his play style. He pretty much
Yeah.
just dribbles down the court, does some
Spin.
crazy move, spins, yeah, hesitation, and he gets to the rack, or he'll get his rebound and finish it, something like that. Then Dejounte Murray, he's like the size up king. Then Trey Young, same thing. Like it's just rough. I don't know how all three of those guys would share the ball. I'm not sure
Right.
how that would work, unless you convert Siakam into some sort of like pick and roll asset, which would be
Yeah.
interesting. But
Not as much
um,
on the ball.
exactly, so that would kind of be interesting to see because I feel like at this point, John Collins was, and I think maybe not right now, but was a little bit more athletic, I think, than Pascal Siakam because we've seen some crazy lobs and crazy dunks from John Collins. Not too much
Right.
high flying from Mr. Siakam, but at the same time, it would be kind of interesting to see Trey Young and Siakam in a pick and roll. But that
Yeah.
might just be me.
Yeah, I guess ultimately where I kind of look at this roster is I feel like there's just a few too many guys on the roster that play the same position, and I feel like ideally you'd like to trim that down to get somebody that plays that position but is better. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Because it's like again you mentioned the wing depth and they do have a ton of forwards, but it's like I'd rather have like two really good ones as opposed to like four or five solid ones. You know what I
I get it.
mean?
Yeah, I
Like
get you.
like yeah, like the Siakam thing, if you can give up like 2 of those guys, like if it was like DeAndre Hunter, and then a couple other guys and you got Siakam, like that's fine. But like you don't have to have like Hunter and AJ Griffin and Sadiq Bey and Jalen Johnson. Like I just feel like that's too many.
Right.
Um,
And that I feel like that could also be said for their PGs too, because I mean you
right.
got Trey Young, Dejounte Murray. I think that's solid. I don't
Mhm.
really understand the Patty Mills one, but I do understand
That
Bufkin.
was just a salary dump thing.
I know, but like you know what I mean. Like I feel like something has to change in terms of the PG depth. I do like it, but like you said, it's better to have two good ones and then a backup. Pretty much that's how it would go. But I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, because that's the thing, especially because like some of these guys are gonna get paid at some point, right? Like Sadiq Bey is gonna get paid relatively soon. And then it's like you're already paying Hunter, you're already paying Sadiq Bey, you're already paying Trey Young, right? I think they gave Dejounte Murray a big extension, so I
Yeah,
mean and this is not a team that's gonna be paying a bunch of guys. You know what I mean? Like this is a smaller market team. That again we just saw them do a cost cutting move by trading away John Collins for nothing. So I mean, like they're not a team that's gonna be comfortable being like way over the cap, spending a ton of money on like a relatively mediocre team.
sure.
So that's where I think like yeah, at a certain point you're gonna need to decide, what you're gonna do and then like just consolidate some of that talent into somebody better.
Yeah,
So
it's
ultimately,
doable.
I guess yeah, like yeah, exactly. So ultimately, in terms of a grade that you'd give them for the offseason, what do you think? Because I think like, there's some good mixed in with some not so great.
Hmm.
But I do kind of want to hear, your overall grade, on Atlanta.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to give them a C. They pretty much got rid of John Collins, which I think it was kind of that time we were kind of like on it because we do like John Collins, but at the same time we do get it. So moving on from John Collins and then signing Wesley Matthews and then Garrison Matthews as well. I don't know. It's just interesting, but and then getting Rudy Gay and waiving him. I mean, just a bunch of moves to kind of cut costs, like you were saying. They're budgeting, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, they didn't get too much better. They did acquire some depth, um, but I'm gonna just give it at a C because that's kind of what they've been for the past few years, just mid.
Yeah, I think yeah, honestly, I think he probably kind of perfectly sums up,
Yeah.
all of it. Because again, they had a relatively, pretty much a no, not relatively, a perfectly average regular season last year. I think in the playoffs, they did take the Celtics to 6, which I think, was better than what I think what you would have thought,
Hmm.
right? I think it was kind of assumed that, the Celtics would kind of like, stomp all over Atlanta. And initially in the beginning of the series they did.
Right.
But Atlanta did have, did show some fight down the stretch of that series. Trae Young hit that game winner. Um, but still, again, like I just, their off season, like it just, I didn't really care a whole lot for what they did. Like I said, the Buffkin thing, that's fine. Um, you know, Trading for Guy, okay, he's raw. We'll see what he looks like in a few years. But
Right.
just dumping John Collins. I mean, again, his value was very low, so you probably weren't going to get a whole lot. Like it feels like that's too little, too late.
Mhm.
Like if it had been a season or so ago, that would have made more sense. But now, like, what was the point of that?
Right.
Um, so that's kind of how I feel about it. Like I think that it's probably going to be a season relatively similar to last year. Like, but I do think they could be a little bit better just because with a new coach, and another year together, right? I think that there'll be a little bit more like, comfortableness, like,
I
in
agree.
terms of, how guys play together. The over under has them at 42.5, which, basically is not much better than last year. Right below in the East, actually the Knicks. And then, right above like Indiana, Chicago, Brooklyn. Like, I think they're in that mix. I think they're
Yeah.
probably like, a play-in team with a chance to be like maybe slightly better than that, depending on like how many wins do they actually get. Like, I think they could get to like a six, seed or something like that. But, again, you'd have to be better than some other teams, right? Because, again, like there are some teams that took a step back. And since the Hawks didn't really get like significantly worse, like, I think at the very least they're probably not much different than what they were before at worst. Like, they'll probably be like maybe a spot higher. Like, I think they could get to that sixth spot, but I
Yeah.
think it's probably more likely that they'll be a play-in team.
I think they're banking on Trey Young.
Yeah,
I think that's what's going on. I think they're looking for Trey Young to have a bounce back season, and if he does, I think like you said, the sixth seed is a definite that should be a goal of theirs. If I'm being
yeah.
honest, because I think
I
it's
think they could.
I think it's doable because we're gonna see some teams take a couple steps back. Brooklyn's
Yep.
gonna fall. I think
Yep.
Miami's gonna fall. Chicago maybe falls. Toronto
Yeah.
maybe
They were
falls as
already better
well.
than Chicago.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like I think those teams will go down and then that'll give them an opportunity to climb and maybe, avoid the play and that would be nice for them. But I think it all is dependent on Trey Young and I don't want to put, pressure on Trey Young, but I doubt Trey Young's going to see this, but I do hope that he does, have a really good season because I think that will also boost how well they do because I think if he has a down season, the Atlanta Hawks in general will have a down season. That's just how it goes because he's the
Yeah, and
focal point of their offense.
yeah, exactly. That makes a ton of sense, right? If your best player plays lower than his ceiling, then you're not going to be as good.
Right.
It's kind of like we mentioned with Tatum. It's a different level, right? But that's kind of like what we mentioned with Tatum for Boston. If he plays
Sure.
like a top five player, the Celtics have a very good chance of winning it all, right?
Right.
But if he's more like, like a top 10 player, right, then that lowers your chances. If
Exactly.
Trey Young gets back to that, all NBA caliber guy, right, where he's like a top, 15 player, and it's like pretty unquestionable, right?
Mhm.
Then yeah, they're going to do a lot better because
Yeah.
again, like you mentioned, some of those teams will take a step back, right? You already have a team that was in the top six that is not going to be a top six team, I don't think, in
Right.
Brooklyn. So
Exactly.
Atlanta was seven, so like
I
they
think
could
they're prime and ready to
move up
take
into
that.
the six.
Yep.
Yeah,
They're
but
ready.
the question is, are they going to be much better than that? Like,
Right.
I mean, like, because the result could be the same where, yeah, you get out of the play-in, but then you still lose in the first
Right.
round,
That's the problem.
to whomever.
That's the
But,
problem. I think a
if
full
you
season with the
avoid
coach though will help.
Milwaukee, yeah, but in fairness, if you can avoid Milwaukee or Boston in the first round, like, I wouldn't pick them to win the series, but like you'd have a better chance, and that's why, like you said, they should aim for avoiding the play-in because avoiding the play-in will make it way less likely that you have to play, one of those two teams.
Right.
Now of course it could backfire where yeah, you're the sixth seed, but then one of those two teams maybe had like a 2 week stretch where a couple of guys were out and then they dropped to like three, and then you
Right.
could end up playing them in the first round. But either way, I think the goal should be to try to avoid the plane because again, otherwise, what was the point of hiring Quinn Snyder? Like clearly, you want to be at least somewhat better, and that makes sense because you gave up picks to get Dejounte Murray, so you should want to be a competitive team.
Right.
Because I know I mentioned like the Siakam thing, like is that going to win you a championship? Probably not, but that doesn't have to be the end goal. The goal can just be let's be a better team. We're better if we make move X versus
Right.
just standing pat. Like
I
there's
agree.
nothing wrong with that, because that was the logic that we had seen from other teams. And then it's like, hey, you never know. Maybe you can make a deep playoff run, once you have that better roster. So,
I agree.
you know, like, That's how I look at this team. Like, I think there's a lot of possibilities for this because again, I can see them being a top 6 squad, but I could also see them being a play-in team. Like you said, I think a lot of it comes down to Trey Young, and then after that, how do the other surrounding pieces fit better this year under Quinn Snyder?
Right.
Yeah, so now to kind of wrap things up, obviously now we're getting into the news and rumors. Obviously, at the beginning of this week was media day.
Yes,
Um,
sirski.
obviously, it's always kind of an exciting time, because it lets us know, like, hey, the season is getting ready to start up. Of course, a lot of different, outlooks and a lot of different, media days for different teams, right? Because we had some like say, the Lakers or Milwaukee, right? Or even like Boston, right? Where like you had teams that had really good vibes coming in, where everybody's incredibly optimistic, about what's going on, talking about like sacrifices and things like that, where it's really good to see. Um, you had some like Golden State where, you're kind of intrigued, right? Because, Chris Paul is like, oh, I'm going to play whatever role, um, you know, that my team asked me. We'll see how it works. But,
Hmm.
like, it's something to think about, right? Because
Right.
again, like, I don't feel like that's historically been his thing. I know that like he has played different roles for different teams, but again, this is different now coming off the bench.
Yeah.
But still, right? It wasn't like a terrible vibe or anything. It was fine. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it
I
was
agree.
like I feel like it was probably better than last year's, where you had two guys that, got into a basic, literal brawl,
Right.
that were on the same team. Um, obviously you had the Suns, right? Where they clearly there was a level of optimism, and I thought it was kind of interesting how the team governor, the owner, right, kind of basically hinted at like, yeah, we wanted to get DeAndre Ayton out of here. He wanted to be out as well.
Makes
And Ayton
sense.
mentioned that in his Portland presser as well, where he's like, I'm bringing back dominate. I'm gonna
Right.
be dominating, and he kind of said like hinted at like, yeah, I didn't want to be a part of that.
Right.
Um,
And I think that makes sense.
yeah, and then of course, then you had some other, intriguing ones like Miami, of course, where
Oh, joy.
you had Jimmy Butler, with his thing,
Yeah.
playing the
Emo
role of
girl.
yeah goth teenager. Um, Kyle Lowry mentioning like he sees himself as the starting point guard. And Tyler Hero taking shots at Portland, so that was
Hmm.
kind of a little bit odd to
They
me,
had a funny
so we'll
one.
see how that looks. Of course, I think one of the biggest highlights, was the Philadelphia one because, of course, James Harden did not actually show up to media day.
Hmm.
Um, he's supposed to show up, to their practice, and as of this recording, he's already there
Yeah.
at Colorado State University. But, still, there's a lot of reports that suggest like, he's gonna be there, but he's gonna make it ugly. He's gonna make his presence felt. Because he wants to make it clear that he has no intentions of staying in Philadelphia. And, that's kind of the thing that I think, is rough for Philly, where you almost feel potentially worse about Philly than maybe even like a Miami, only because it's like, I don't know how you solve the situation with a guy that doesn't want to be there and he's one of your best, and most important players. Like I
Right.
like Miami, like okay, like you can get over the Lowry thing because he's not necessarily quite as, an important piece of the roster as, like Butler and Bam. But like, with Harden, because that's, one of your main guys, like I just don't know how you solve that equation, without some type of deal. But, it doesn't seem like, right now that's in the cards, which again, I understand Philly, wants to get something back for Harden, but then it's like, Harden's also making it really hard for other teams to want to pick him up. So I do kind of wonder like who wins, this chess battle, ultimately. I don't even know if it's a chess battle, but like,
It is. I think Harden's gonna come out on top though. It's just gonna be a long time. But at the same
right.
time, it depends on what your definition of on top is. Like if your definition of on top in this situation is okay, yeah, Harden's just out of there and he's just gone, okay, cool, then probably Harden wins. But if he gets sent to like, NBA Siberia, then
Right.
I think Philly probably wins.
Yeah. Yeah, because ultimately, again, if you're Philly, you got to see if you can get back the best deal.
Right.
As we've been talking about, before, right? Because again, obviously Harden has a team that he wants to go to. Well, it seems like it's the Clippers, but the Clippers are not going to just give up. We're not going to give up Paul George, for James Harden. Like that's
Right.
not happening.
Yeah,
So,
no,
which
no,
is
no.
understandable. So,
Yeah.
um, we'll see what happens. But yeah, like I guess kind of go over your thoughts on what you saw
Sure.
with media day. It was also kind of cool to see like some guys talk about how they're committed to playing in the Olympics. But
Mhm.
what did you think overall of the media day
Yeah,
stuff?
this
What were
was
your kind of highlights and lowlights?
yeah, this
Um,
was one of like the most intriguing media days I think that I've paid attention to in a long time. I haven't paid attention to a lot of them. Normally, I kind of just look at the Wizards and leave it at that and see the ones on Bleacher Report. But I was kind of scouring, the entire league for this one.
yeah,
I thought the Orlando Magic one was kind of interesting. I thought there was a lot more wholesome content this year. A lot of like, the social media teams, I thought they did a great job, showing guys personalities. I think that's something that was really cool because we do have to remember these guys are pretty human. They bleed just like us. So, it's kind of interesting to see their outtakes on life. And I thought the questions that were asked were very good. Where do you see yourself? Kind of just the normal stuff, what did you improve on this season for the young guys? And then, obviously following certain storylines. I think the Golden State one is probably the most intriguing one out of all of
yeah,
them, probably just because of the certain comments that were said by certain people. Steph pretty much said, I want to be a warrior for life. Then you
yeah,
have Draymond saying, well, my teammate is an a-hole. And then Chris Paul is saying, like, yeah, well, I also want to play my role regardless of what it is. So it's like, it's kind of interesting to see everybody's outlooks on everything.
right,
Like I said, I thought the Orlando one was kind of interesting. That one seemed more like comedic. I think, some of them are and were intentionally funny because some teams don't have a lot to really look forward to. Like with Miami, you don't want to sit on that dark cloud of not getting Damian Lillard. And, they poke fun at that,
yeah,
Tyler Hero, like you said, he was taking shots at people, and then Jimmy Butler did his emo thing, which lasted, I think, only for that day. Like it's gone now.
yeah,
So, I thought it was very good. And then even like teams in kind of interesting positions like the Wizards, I thought they had an interesting one, kind of showcasing the chemistry between Jordan Poole, Kyle Kuzma. They kind of basically did TikToks together. That's kind of the sum up of ours. And then I'm trying to think. There was one other that was interesting. I think Brooklyn's was interesting as well. They showcased kind of like everybody that they brought in, and also their younger pieces in Cam Johnson, McCall Bridges, guys like that. So, uh, like I said, or like you said, actually, I think the Philly one is probably the worst one because the pictures they came out and Harden was not present, and that's not a good look. But at the same time, we understand why Harden is absent, and I think he has the right to do so. I'm just not sure what the ramifications and implications are going to be. If he continues to hold out, like you said, he is at the their training camp, but I'm sure he's probably a limited participant, and he's not a happy camper. Because
yeah.
I'm sure a big fine was going to be mailed to his, address.
Yeah. What do you think like could potentially be like the wildest thing he could end up doing at training camp? Like, because I just feel
Hmm.
like you're gonna get like at least some type of story like
Right.
about something, Because I remember what was it? It was Simmons, right before that, right where he showed up like in pajamas or
Right.
whatever, or whatever, or sweatpants, whatever it
Right.
was. And like he was there but didn't really do anything.
Sure.
Um,
I feel like Harden is going to make headlines. I think number one, I think he may come into the training camp maybe looking a little out of shape. That wouldn't surprise me. And I think that would make some waves. And I think that would maybe, put Philly in a bad light. And that would be intentional. But that's about it that I can really think of. Maybe he does something even crazier. I don't think he would do anything to intentionally harm his teammates. I don't think he's
no.
that kind of person or, put his teammates in a bad light. But the organization in general wouldn't surprise me if he, walked in there with a F Daryl Murray shirt or something. I don't know.
Well, they
That
just put
wouldn't
out a
surprise me.
picture of him at practice actually.
Oh,
And
really?
he's
What does
just
it look like?
Yeah, I mean, he's just kind of like, he's just kind of like just dribbling a ball, like, at practice. Like, it's basically,
Okay, that's not horrible. All right, then never mind. That throw that out the window. But
but
I
that's the
think,
first one, we'll
yeah,
see.
maybe down the line he does something stupid, but who knows? He may actually play good soldier for once and just, ball out and hoop because that's what the NBA is about. Obviously, outside of
I
making
don't know.
money.
I feel like he's going to cause a
What
stink
do
at
you
some,
think?
I think he's going to cause a stink at some point. Cause again, like, he already knows, like, right now, like, Philly isn't going to just give him up. So,
Right.
like, I think he's like, thinking like, all right, well, we got to make it uncomfortable. We got to make it nasty. We got to make it difficult,
Sure.
to basically kind of like force Philly into like, making it so that they have no choice but to move him,
Sure.
or else it'll be a huge disruption to the team. Because, like you said, I think it has more so to do with the front office and the ownership more so than the actual team.
Right.
Because he gave up money and he wants his money. But he did give up money in other stops as well. And it's like he's also just not making a good case right now for why another team should want, to pick him up and give him another opportunity because he is running out of opportunities. But,
Right.
I think, this is kind of one of the this might be the number one story in the NBA right now. Just because of, again, like, yeah, like we had a lot of other really good media days, but, that one in particular, just because we don't have too many other ones right now because all the other ones got moved, like
Yeah.
Beal's gone. So obviously he didn't, cause a stink, say in
Right.
Washington. Lillard's gone, so he didn't cause a stink in Portland.
Right.
Um, so now it's pretty much just him. All eyes are kind of on him now. In terms of what does Philly do because
Yeah.
there's a lot of ramifications down the line for whatever happens.
Yeah, and like, kind of just to continue about media day. There were some other
Yeah,
positive takeaways from it also. Lonzo, he came out and said that he's young, he's 25 and he said he's going to play again. So that's good to kind of hear um from the head of the horse, I think that's good to hear that he's in good spirits. Obviously he's not playing this season, but he was available for media day. I think that was the right decision to have him there as well.
hmm
Um, there was another team. I thought Indiana's was kind of interesting as well, showcasing,
right.
Jerace Walker, the rookies,
Yeah,
Halliburton. I think we should be looking for Halliburton to take a huge leap. I think, he could get
yeah,
in that upper echelon tier of superstars potentially down the line, and I think this season could be the start of it. But yeah, overall, I thought this was a really personable, and interpersonal media day. This is something that I hadn't seen in a while. Even
yeah,
the Lakers one, I thought that was a really good one. I thought they did good, showcasing some guys' work ethic. LeBron, I
right.
think he had some good statements. So and even the head coach, I think your coach did a good job of, kind of just trying to feed the flames, I guess, because I
Yeah.
think the Lakers are it's a different breed when it comes to them because there's so much pressure with you guys. But overall, I thought it was really good.
Yeah, because I tend to look at me, like you said, media day is always kind of something where it's like, like some people look at it, some people don't. I usually look at, at least like some of the big ones
Hmm.
here, and it is kind of funny because I just remember last year's Laker media day, and it just felt very awkward
Of
because you knew
course.
there were a number of guys like that probably thought that they weren't going to be there that ended up being there, say like a Russell Westbrook, right?
Hmm.
Like I'm sure he thought he was probably going to get moved and he was there and he was honest he was very honest about the situation, which you do appreciate the honesty, but I just it was kind of funny because I do remember like there was a question last year where I think a reporter asked him like, do you feel wanted by the Lakers? And he was basically like, well, we all have jobs and sometimes people at our jobs don't like us.
Right.
So, it was a very strange media day last year and like, now it's like a complete and neither LeBron nor AD, I don't think talked about a championship at all in their media day because they knew that wasn't a championship team, to begin that
Sure.
season. But now like it's a complete 180, right? Where like now you got more guys where like you said it feels more like they're committed, to winning a championship.
Hmm.
That's kind of what you want to see, with a team that has LeBron and AD on it, not a team, where it's like I remember I think it was Rob Pelinka last year where he was like, yeah, our goal, is to have a roster, that can compete every night. And it's like that's shouldn't be the goal when you have LeBron and AD, but you just didn't have a good enough roster. But like you said, it always kind of is fascinating to look at media day because it's kind of like the last day where it's like you can kind of like be full on optimistic, because then the actual basketball starts, and
Right.
some of these teams, like you said, won't have as much to look forward to once the season actually starts.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the
but media
unfortunate stuff.
yeah, right, exactly. But, again, like you always want to hear guys, talk about like, hey, how their off season went, what are their goals coming into this season, so I think that's always kind of intriguing as well. Because again, it's not just about, you know, the basic stuff. There's a lot of other aspects to look
Yeah.
at as well. So I think that's always cool to see. Because, again, like you said, it makes it a lot more personable
Yeah.
and relatable, like, where you like, you actually get to hear from the players, talk about other stuff. So that's always cool.
Yeah. What did you think of the rookies? Did you tune into any of the rookie ones?
Yeah, like I saw, some of Scoot's, and he mentioned like, I'm not trying to be, the next Damian Lillard,
Right.
I'm trying to be Scoot, like,
Good answer.
and I think that's a good response because it kind of gives off the vibe that like, he's ready for, this new role to being like the new face of the franchise. And he's, looking to carve out his own path. So I
Mhm.
like that response a lot. That was one of the main ones that I saw. And I think, yeah, like I said, that's, Portland will be an interesting watch, this season to see how he looks.
Yeah.
I saw some of the Spurs, and there was a lot of optimism, a lot of smiles there as well, talking about, a lot of different things. So that was kind of cool,
Did Wemby
to
look
see.
bigger to you?
Um, see, like the thing about media day is, you always hear guys say like, oh, I put on like, X amount of muscle,
Mhm.
or whatever, or I cut like X% of body fat. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell because he was already so thin.
Right. He looked a little
It's
bit
like,
more toned though. I don't
yeah,
know, but that
exactly.
could
I
have
think
just been me.
right, yeah, because there was a similar thing, with Rui Hachimura, where like, there were clips of him in the off season, where a lot of people were saying like, oh, he looks a lot slimmer,
Mhm.
'cause he's, planning to play like more small forward as opposed to power forward, but he, cleared it up where he was like, lose much weight, I'm just more defined, but like, part of why it looks like that is because I'm standing next to LeBron, which, again, don't make a lot of
Yeah.
guys look small, because Rui's not a small guy, but
No,
like,
no, no, not at all.
next to LeBron, he does look pretty small.
Right.
So that could be what it is. Where, like you said, he may be more toned, like or more defined.
Right.
Where it's like he didn't really put on a lot of weight, but he just put on more muscle. And if
Right.
that's the, I think that's a good sign, for Wenbanyama and the Spurs, because he does need to get stronger,
Yeah.
and that's probably part of the reason why, there's a lot of talks about him probably playing a lot of four as opposed to just being a straight up center.
Right. And like I think the only media day that I didn't even like get a glimpse of might have been Charlotte. So I don't know if you saw that, but I didn't
Uh,
look at it. I only
uh,
saw their training camp footage
yeah.
with Terry Rozier. That's it. I didn't see any of the
Yeah.
media day
All
though.
I heard about was, them getting the sponsorship deal,
Right, with Mr. Beast.
yeah, with the YouTuber Mr.
Yeah.
Beast. That's all I heard. I didn't really like look at the
Yeah,
Hornets
me
media.
neither.
'Cause some of the media days are a little bit harder to I don't want to say harder to find, but like, like some of them they'll put it on their socials. Like
Right.
say New Orleans, the Pelicans, right? They had like all their main guys, they put clips, of the players on media day, on like their X page.
The
Uh,
Pelicans one was interesting. I thought that
right,
was very interesting. I think it was
right.
their
Zion
I think it
looked
was
like
their who was it? I can't remember who it was. I think it was their chairman of operations. He was like,
yeah.
"Yeah, this is the first year that Zion actually
Yeah,
took
that was
his
David Griffin.
nutrition." Yeah, he was like, "This is the first year that he took his nutrition seriously." I'm like, "Okay, so no more hand holding. So they're not going to baby him anymore. They're actually going to make him be
Yeah,
accountable for his actions." Good.
and he looked like he was in better
Yeah.
shape as well.
And he even
Um,
said the only thing I worked on this season was what? Being unguardable.
yeah,
Hey, we could be finally getting the Zion that we need.
right, yeah, because that's the main thing is, again, for him, it was never the question about the talent, it's always about the conditioning and the health, because we've
Exactly.
talked about it numerous times. When he plays, he's, an all NBA
We
caliber
deem
guy,
it.
or talent, but but he's usually not on the floor, so,
Right.
his running mate isn't necessarily on the floor as a whole lot either, so,
Yeah.
hopefully they can kinda figure that out.
Yeah.
Um, more rumors. So obviously, we talked about the Harden stuff.
Mhm.
We talked about the Clippers side of it, but coming from Cleveland, so like Mitchell, he wants to sign an extension or a new deal, but not an extension. So like, it's kind of like what we talked about with some of these previous players, like even a Siakam, right? Where it's like, you know, they want to be on that all NBA so they can get the super max. They don't want to sign an extension right now because they're going to get less. Like to me, that makes a lot of sense.
Right. It's a money
And
move.
Mitchell was all NBA last year. And if he has another really good season, he could be on it again. Obviously, the guard spot, that's a very competitive all NBA race.
Yeah.
Um, because there's a lot of guards, that have a chance of being all NBA. Like Lillard was not all NBA last year, if I'm not mistaken, right? Or was he?
He was not.
Yeah, and so, he's if he's, has a healthier season, he's gonna be on that list.
Yep.
Probably, because he's still very good. So but again, it makes sense, to try to bet on yourself and try to get that money. I
Yeah.
can't really. I think that's fine.
That's what he should do. And I think that's probably, what his agent and his people told him to do. And I don't
Right.
think Cleveland takes that as disrespect or anything.
No.
Um, it's just how the business goes. But I think he'll probably be in Cleveland. Um, for a decent amount of time.
Yeah. Next up, Reggie Bullock. We talked about him getting bought out by the Spurs. Potentially to a contender, but he ended up going to Houston. Um, again, my guess is that, this is probably a scenario where I guess, like, he'll get a decent amount of minutes. I'm curious because, they do have a number of other players, at those positions, right? He
Sure,
plays like guard and forward.
sure.
They do it, they have guys like Jalen Green, right? Thompson, um, Jay Sean Tate, Dylan
Mhm.
Brooks, obviously, who they just signed. I guess, with the Kevin Porter Jr. situation, I guess another guard spot will have opened up in the
Yes,
rotation. Um, again, like, I think he's a solid player that can help a lot of teams. The Houston signing kind of surprises me.
me
Because
too.
I just, just the wording from Shams kind of made it seem like, and Woj made it seem like he was probably going to go to a contender.
We thought
But he's
Denver.
also the type of player where it's like, he's good enough to that he should be getting minutes, and maybe the minutes weren't necessarily there for some teams, but oh my goodness, the test of uh the wireless emergency alert system just went off. That kind of caught me
Oh,
off
really?
guard. Yeah, but yeah, so that's kind of how I look at it, from that perspective. Is just it surprised me that he didn't go to a contender.
Yeah,
Um, so like I don't dislike the signing. I wish it was another team, like like a team like a Milwaukee, or a team, like I don't know, any contender, right?
I
Like it
was
could be
hoping for Denver.
yeah, like Denver. Yeah, Denver. You mentioned. I think that would have been a really good pickup. Because again, I'm assuming it's for the minimum.
Right,
But again, like that's the thing. Like I wish he had gone somewhere else.
right.
But we'll see what he does. For the Rockets because he's a good player that I think can help them.
Sure.
But again, like how good is Houston gonna be? Like is their season? Not that like he changes the course of your season, but like you know I feel like he could help out a team like Denver more than a team like Houston.
I
But
agree.
in fairness, he's also a veteran, that could be a mentor for some of the young guys. And we know, like, they need a little bit of help over there, which is
Yeah.
why they got some young, some older guys,
Well, this is a
there as
different
well.
Houston. I feel like a lot of people are sleeping on them. I'm definitely going to continue to sleep on them until I
Right,
see them, play. But it is kind of interesting, Fred Van Vliet, Jalen Green, Jabari Smith. That's an interesting core of guys.
right.
So we'll see.
Devin Vassell, 5 year, $146 million extension, right? Obviously, wing player for the Spurs, 3 and D. I don't have a problem with it. I mean, it is a lot of money, but the cap will continue to go up.
Hmm.
I think he's a good player, and I think he's a good fit alongside, that young core that they have there. Like with, obviously Wenbanyama, Keldon Johnson, Sohan, right? Guys like that. I think this is a no brainer. If you're the Spurs, there's no point in letting them walk. Like I said, it's obviously a lot of money, but I think he's a pretty valuable part of this roster because of what he
Yeah.
can do, on both ends of the floor. And you're going to need guys like that, with this first team because again, you got the number one pick, so now you're kind of at a point where like, yeah, get some talent, and if you can retain that talent, keep it.
Right. And, I saw a lot of people ripping that move to shreds all over the place. And I was
Right,
like, you guys didn't keep that same energy when the same thing happened with Michael Porter Jr. I mean, come on now. It's literally the same thing.
right,
People were trying to say he's an unproven player. No, 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 no. That's talent, and they're just locking it up long term. Simple as that.
right. Yeah, like he had a career year last year. 18 and a half a game.
That's
Um,
good, bro.
3.5 assists, 4 rebounds, over a steal, 39 from three. Like, I think he's a good player.
Yeah,
Only played 38 games, but that was also a tanking team. So there were
sure.
probably games where he could have played that, where he just didn't play. So I'm expecting big things out of him. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like I said, it is a lot of money, but I have no issues with it because I think he's good. And if you're the Spurs, you'd rather keep a guy like that than even, give him a chance to go into restricted free agency and potentially leave. You know what I mean? Like,
Exactly. I
might
think
as
it's a
well, like
great move.
Corey Jr. Lock him up long term, make him a core part of your roster, and move forward.
Yeah,
There's no
exactly.
need really, you know, put any more time or pressure on that.
You
Like,
might as well
get
pay him because you're not getting any free agents anyways.
right, yeah, exactly. Like especially not right now. Like,
No,
like maybe down the line, but even then, like the Spurs didn't even never got free agents when Duncan was on the roster, and he
no.
was a very good NBA player. So
They built through the draft, and that's how they do
yeah,
it.
right, exactly. Um, Wizards pick up head coach option on Wes Unseld Jr., right? So the Washington Post. So that means, again, like more stability. He'll be there, I guess, for another year.
Hmm.
Obviously that doesn't mean he'll last, but
Yeah.
regardless, either way, it's like what we talked about, where it's like I'm curious to see what he does, like now that there's not as much like, as many politics that he has to play around with
Hmm.
now. And again, maybe it still doesn't work out. Obviously, again, they're not going to be winning, 45, 50 games, for sure. But, I do wonder, like, because now this is the first year where, like, technically the pressure's off, but, like, obviously there's still pressure to win games because, obviously if they go like, 5-70 something, right, then he'd probably be done.
Yeah,
But, you know, like, again, as the Wizards fan, who has at different times had something to say about Wes Unseld Jr.,
yeah.
how you feeling about it?
I'm not a fan. I think you know that, and everybody who's watched the podcast consistently knows that. Uh, I question his decision making sometimes. I definitely question something that he's touted himself on, and that's the player development. He always talks about player development, but we haven't really seen, the leaps that some of these guys should have taken, I think, but it's neither here nor there. I think he's just on the hot seat somewhat. It's kind of interesting to be on the hot seat during a rebuild. I think that's a really interesting position to be in because you're going to be performing, bad per se, but at the same time, the reason you're going to get, I guess, outed is not
Right,
necessarily because your team is bad, but maybe due to other reasons. They might not like, the certain system you're running. It could have been
right,
better. There's just a whole bunch of factors. So I feel like a lot is on the line for him.
right.
And I'm not like hating on him. I don't want him necessarily gone. I would just like him to be a more decisive decision maker because it seems like he doesn't sometimes know what he's doing.
Yeah, the Brett Brown situation I think is very rare where you have a coach, who gets to coach through an entire rebuild and then last through that rebuild and
Right.
also get through, like the early parts of like where the team starts to be good. Usually like the coach doesn't last,
Exactly.
quite that long. Like, because we've seen it before, right? Like, we've seen coaches, you know, like we saw Silas, right? Steven Silas, right? He got fired while the Rockets, were kind of through the worst part of their rebuild, and now they're a little bit better, right? But he's gone. They replaced him
Right.
with somebody else, Ime Udoka, which again, like to me, he's a better coach, so that's fine. But just in general, right? Like that tends to happen a lot. So I do kind of wonder, like, like how much faith and confidence do they have in him, as a head coach? And again, like it's rough because if they do win like 25 games, like you know that's not entirely on him because it's not an amazing roster. But at the
Sure.
same time, the worse he does, right, the more likely he'll be on the hot seat.
Yeah,
Um,
I think they'll be breaking down a lot of his decisions, how they lose games. I think that's also important. And you also have to keep in mind brand new management too. So, this isn't their guy. They didn't hire him. You know what I mean? Like it's kind
exactly.
of the
Yeah.
same thing in the NFL. Like we see, quarterbacks get drafted by one regime and then
Yep.
another regime comes in and then they're like, "You're not our guy. We don't have any attachment to you." So then that person's out of there. So,
Yeah.
we
Exactly.
could we could be seeing that. But it seems like Washington, I think they're doing it the right way. They're kind of giving everybody on the team a clean slate at this point.
Yeah.
Even Johnny Davis said it. Multiple people have said it. And they're just looking to see what they have and build from that. I think that should be their goal, including
Then
coaching.
last but not least, according to ESPN and of course, obviously the Grizzlies, Ja is cleared to practice and travel with the team. So obviously, we know he's going to be suspended, for that first stretch of the season, 25 games or so. But even despite the suspension, he'll still be able to practice and travel.
Mm,
With the team, which again, like I don't really see a huge problem with that. Because again, they do have some guys on there, where it's like Memphis will be an interesting team to watch because again, historically, right, the first year that he missed a lot of time, they were a good team. Last year they were closer to 500. Now the West is better. So how good do they do while he's out? I think that can kind of determine how far their season can go.
sure.
Obviously, they picked up some guys like Marcus Smart. Um, Derrick Rose, we didn't mention it, in the media day, he kind of gave like an interesting take, where he's like,
Yeah,
I'm not here to babysit, John Morant, I'm kind of here, just, being me and whatnot, like I think, again, like, because Ja is at a point where like he's gonna have to, kind of learn, to take that next step, as a leader, to mature and grow. And that's one way that Memphis, can improve and be like a more serious, contender, right? Because that had been the
sure.
issue for them, where like, yeah, they were very good in the regular season. And, they weren't necessarily horrible in the playoffs, but like, you felt like, they could have done a little bit better. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
I get
like
you.
there's no shame in losing to the Warriors, 2 seasons ago, particularly, when Ja was out for half that series. Um, And even like last year, right? Like, yeah, they had the issue with they had the issue with the bigs where they had guys out, but still, you just felt like, you know, you felt like, like they didn't handle it that great, right? Because obviously, they made a lot of headlines, for like, a lot of the bravado, and it ended up, kind of, knocking them down in the face. They ended up getting like, yeah, like pie on the face, basically. But
pretty much.
I think last year, hopefully for them, should be a humbling moment. And particularly with the Josh suspension, hopefully he comes back, stronger and better, you know, equipped, to lead this team, because that's how they're gonna, go as far as they can go. They can only go as far as Ja can take them, right? Obviously, the other guys, obviously play a big role as well, right? We'll see what Marcus Smart does, for the Grizzlies, but if Ja, you know, isn't in the right mindset, then they're not gonna go that far, like because again, like you're only as strong as your, strong as as your strongest links. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
obviously everyone else matters, but the leader matters as well.
I
So
get that. And
yeah,
like,
if your leader is not in a great state of mind, then that's kind of rough. But hopefully, the time off will do him some good.
mhm,
Um, where he's not creating headlines and he's not causing any issues. And he just kind of gets to focus on like, working on his game, getting better. Every day as a lead, as a player and as a person, and he comes back stronger. And if he comes back stronger, then Memphis, will be a better team for it. Again, like it's a long time, so they're gonna have to survive without him. Um, but the fact that he can practice and travel with the team at least gives him a chance, again, to bond, and I think, kind of mend some, fences and bridges that he, might have not done a good job of, handling last year. You
yeah.
know what I mean? Like this is not like an untenable,
Yeah.
unsolvable, unsalvageable situation. I think it can be salvaged. It just comes down to him, I think.
Sure. And it's like I think Memphis is in a really interesting spot. They lost Tyus Jones, but they did gain Marcus Smart, who's a seasoned vet, and then also Derrick Rose, who's another vet. And I think that was something that they were kind of missing, that experienced vet
Right.
from both sides. So now you have it, at two guard positions, which is phenomenal. I think, they can be somewhat mentors to Ja, but like, Derrick Rose said, he's not going to be a freaking babysitter. Like that's just not how it goes.
Right.
So it should be interesting, but I think they'll be able to hold their own. I think Marcus Smart being in the lineup will help them tremendously because I think Marcus Smart will provide that team a little bit more than Tyus Jones did. Although Tyus Jones, was historically one of the better backup, point guards in the league. But I think Marcus Smart will, suffice for as long as Jaws out.
Yeah, and he'll probably start, and he will start, I think, while Ja's out.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts of, our takes on, the Wizards and the Hawks, in the comments. And it's gonna be intriguing, right? Because now the season is kind of underway, right? Like we're recording this a day earlier than we normally would, but
Yeah.
um, so technically, the first preseason game is Thursday, right? Between the Mavericks and Minnesota, and obviously we'll probably get into some of the preseason games,
Of course.
as yeah, exactly, as our podcast goes on. But like I said, welcome to the new NBA season. I think it's gonna be, one for the ages. I think there's a lot of exciting teams.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about a number of different teams. Even teams that aren't really contenders. Like I think, like some of the young teams. Like I think there should be optimism in terms of the young guys and how they
And
pan
even
out.
just players, if it's not
Right.
teams,
So
just guys in the league.
right, exactly. So and again, we'll get into all of that, as the season takes off. So,
Yep.
again, don't forget to like and subscribe, and comment your thoughts down, below. And thanks for listening. And we'll see you next week.